Welcome back to GEARHAULICS, everybody, the place where we talk about one of the few passions where you can spend thousands of dollars to be a professional hobo. My name is Dave, aka Fireball. I'm joined again by my two co-hosts. We've got Jason Huck Outdoors, and we've also got Jared, aka Snackbox from Outside Comfort Zone. How you guys feeling tonight?
Doing good.
Feeling good, feeling good.
Right on. So the first ever episode, head on over and check it out, was based off of top quilts. And today we figured we'd kind of just move right along in that whole big four category. And we're going to be talking about tents. Now, tents span a lot of different categories here. So we're going to focus a little bit more so on non-freestanding tents this time around. So to kick it off here, I've got what exactly are non-freestanding tents and what are they all about? So the traditional tent is going to be a pole structure, right? You have poles that you interlock together and it forms the overall structure of your tent. A semi-freestanding is different from that in that you just have a little bit less poles and you kind of have to stake out a couple of your corners. And then you've got your non-freestanding tents, which are the ultralighter's dream, which are basically erected by either carbon fiber poles or your trekking poles. And yes, snack box, I said erected, so just deal with it. But yeah, it's kind of a little overview of a non-freestanding tents. And I'm just going to move right into the second one here because I don't think there's anything else to really talk about that. I hope I didn't really miss anything. So let's jump on over into the different types of fabrics. And the only thing that I really need to say about this one, I think you've got a few different kinds that are kind of the standard, but I want to get your guys' take on this as well. First of which would be a poly type of material. Then you've got your sil polys, which tend to be a little bit more hydrophobic or shed the water a little bit better. And then you've got your a Dyneema style tents or DCF Cuban fiber, formerly known as Cuban fiber, which are ultra expensive and pretty, I don't know, I kind of call it stupid expensive and not really worth it in my opinion, but that's obviously highly debatable. And I think we're still waiting on the ultra fabric tents, if I'm not mistaken. But what do you guys think on fabrics? Any interesting tidbits on fabrics used for tents?
There's not a ton. I mean, it's similar to when we were talking about quilts in episode 1 that they'll be measured by denier, so the thickness of the fabric, and it's really a trade-off. So the least durable are typically the lightest, and they tend to also be the most expensive. And so certainly there's a premium paid for the lighter the tent and the smaller it'll pack.
Oh yeah, and those DCF Cuban fiber tents are crazy expensive.
Yeah, DCF. DCF
Yeah,
standing for DCF meaning Dyneema carbon fiber.
composite.
Cuban
Composite.
fiber.
Cuban fiber, that's right, Cuban fiber, because it's sort of woven into the shape of cubes, I believe. And it was initially developed actually to be the sail for racing sailboats. And so it was this material that a bunch of sort of cottage makers picked up on. And, you know, if you want a sort of an amazing kind of Google trip, look up the Sierra Designs UFO Mojo, which was an $1,800, one of the first forays into mass marketing DCF. But that DCF tends to not stretch. That's the other piece that's different than the sort of nylon or sil nylon, is that the stretch is very different for that, where there's no stretch. And then what that means for you as a backpacker is that you'll probably or often need to sort of tighten up the corners if you're, especially if you're in wet weather, rainy conditions.
Right on. Yeah, one other thing, and let me know, guys, if you have any other insight into this. I mean, none of us here are insiders or have like a direct link. Maybe Huck does with Devin at Waymark, but I'm kind of curious as to when we can expect to see ultra tents, or are there any kind of setbacks for that? Is there an issue with getting sheets that are long enough, or are companies just kind of like testing the waters with their backpacks first before trying the tents? What do you guys think on that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know.
I think you might be able to see like that, like the eco pack material, maybe a tent made from that.
Mhm.
But as far as like the ultra material that's in some of the backpacks, I just don't see that happening anytime soon. Maybe with supply chains, maybe, because I know like the DCF has a pretty crazy supply chain issue sometimes. So maybe going into Ultra, but I just don't see it happening anytime soon.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I was just curious because I know you hear a lot now with Ultra that, and I don't know how true it is, but I've caught wind and heard more than once that, like, is Dyneema dead or is Ultra the Dyneema killer here? And I think it's still a little bit too early to tell on that one.
For the backpacks, yeah. But tents, yeah.
I think we might be at a really weird sort of historic moment too, where, during the pandemic, there was sort of a lot of people had a lot of free time on their hands. So a lot of people who might not have taken up backpacking kind of took off to the woods. And often these are people who might have had some disposable income and full-time jobs that suddenly opened up. So the reason I bring that up is a lot of the tents out there, there might not be a lot of appetite for these tent makers to be diving into new tent materials, given that they're probably sort of an oversaturation of nice DCF tents on the used market for folks to pick up that because everybody's back in office or whatever, right?
Yeah, makes sense. All right. Without diving too deep, let's move on to our next one here, which is to talk about the weights. Now, again, really depends on, how many people you want to fit in a tent. I think this show is geared a little bit more towards backpacking, maybe a little bit of car camping. So, let's just talk in general, broad strokes terms as to, what kind of ballparks we can expect from weights with tents. So if we're talking about, your standard, poly type of tent that is a starter tent, and maybe you get it off of Amazon. Maybe it's, something that you don't want to spend a lot of money on. They're usually anywhere within the 4 to 5 pound range for like anywhere from like a 1 to 2p. And then, again, if we're talking about non-freestanding tents, which this episode is really about, it really depends, again, I think on the type of fabric that's used. So Dyneema is going to be the ultra light and ultra stupid expensive, like we had just mentioned, and then anywhere kind of in between. I know Snackbox and we both have Gossamer Gears, the one tent, which I think is a sil poly, and that ends up being slightly heavier than DCF, but again, kind of packs down pretty nicely. But anything on weights that you guys have there?
Well, I've got quite a few. I'm looking at the sil poly tents. I think I'm a big 6 Minute Designs fan. So the Solo, the Haven Tarp, Skyscape Trucker, they're all ranging right around 24, 26, 28 ounces in there. And if you go to something where it is DCF, it is going to be lighter. However, when you're doing that, the DCF material, the packability is going to be different. You can't pack that down as easy as the sil poly tents.
Right.
Yeah, I think those 3 tents are also a great example of the other thing that really impacts the weight is the sort of features that come with it, meaning that there are a lot of these non-freestanding tents when you get into the ultralight range, like the Deschutes Plus that doesn't have a floor, or the Deschutes Regular that doesn't have a floor, or the Bugnet Skirt. But then you have the Skyscape Trekker that has the full sort of the full setup where you've got a zipper and a bug net and a floor, bathtub, etc. So one of the things that you're going to run into when you're considering weight are all the features that you can and can't have, because there's a far greater range of variations or sort of iterations of the freestanding tent when you get into the ultra light range than there would be for a freestanding tent.
All great points. Let's move over into the next category. Again, talking about non-freestanding tents today, and let's talk a little bit for a moment about widths and lengths. Again, really depends on if you're going 1P, 2P for non-freestanding. For me in particular here, one of the things that you need to look at is the style of tent. Is it your traditional A-frame? Are you looking at the X-Mid from the Dan Durston gear? Because that will kind of indicate, and also, our Gossamer gear, the one, it really depends on where you put your poles and how steep the head end and the foot end really is. Because you can look at interior dimensions of the floor. Again, if you're going 2P, if you can get a 50-inch wide tent that is a non-freestanding tent, then you've kind of got the unicorn there. But a lot of them are smaller than that. And then for the overall length, you might be looking at it going, well, 90 inches seems like it's plenty. But again, with that slope on your head and foot end, you really need to take those into account. So what do you guys think on the widths and lengths of non-freestanding tents?
I feel like we might be about on the same page and wanted to head in the same direction. So I'll let you start there, Huck.
Well, one thing is the volume, the size of the tent. You've got really, when you're looking for a campsite in general, you got to make sure you've got the room for it compared to a freestanding tent. That's one of the biggest problems I've had, is finding that correct campsite.
Yeah, it can be really challenging, specifically because when you have to stake it in, if you start hitting one or two rocks that don't line up with the rocks where you've already chosen them, it can be pretty frustrating. Yeah. And there's also a learning curve. So, one of the advantages of freestanding tent is you can set it up and then pick it up literally and move the whole tent, or even shake it out to get the stuff out. But when you start talking of the non-freestanding tents, you're going to cut weight drastically, and space as well, because you can often use those trekking poles, as Dave was mentioning, with the Gossamer gear. But the campsite selection is going to be tougher, and you need to practice at home to make sure when you get out there, you are not in a situation, because in the non-freestanding tents, like the Deschutes or those Six Moons, or even when we're getting into the duplexes, the order you stake them in and how you tighten them really matters and makes a world of difference.
Yep.
Yeah. 100%. But yeah, just to kind of recap that there and add a little bit to it. Again, if you're in a 1P, I would definitely recommend something that is at least somewhere around 30 inches wide or wider. And usually the width when you're in it is pretty legit when you're looking at the overall number of inches that you get from a width standpoint. But again, from head to foot, you want something at least, I would say, 90 inches on an A-frame style, if not longer, if you can get it, because of that steep slope that you got kind of coming up, especially when you go to sit up to headroom. You also have to take into account how thick is your pad and where is the head end based on your face. Is it going to be falling in your face? You don't want that to happen either. All right, let's move on to the next one, which is the price points. And for me personally, I kind of break this down into three different styles, like a beginner, sort of like a mid-range, and then your pro, person who is legit, I'm going to go out backpacking all the time. So for me, I have two of those ranges. I've got the sort of the entry level, the Lanshan series from 3FUL Gear, great Japanese company. That tent for the 1P is somewhere around the 2 pound mark. It's actually somewhere around 29 ounces to get super nerdy. And then what we were talking about with the Gossamer Gear, the one, kind of graduating to that. And again, the price point for the Lanshan is going to be, I think it's under $200, closer to $150. And then the Gossamer Gear tent is going to weigh somewhere around 21 ounces all in, maybe a little bit more if you include some more of the guy lines, but then that's also going to run you somewhere around the 250 to 280 range. And then the upper end is going to be, your Z packs or your tarp tent rainbow or something like that. That's DCF. And again, they start off somewhere around, I think, $600, guys. But what do you think on the price points?
Pretty much spot on there. The more you're paying, you're getting to the DCF, and you said 600, 700, and then there's some other DCF tents I've seen that are crazy expensive, $800, $900.
Yeah, it's just nuts. It doesn't, from the beginner style tent, like a poly or something like that, to a sil poly. I understand that jump; it kind of makes sense. But then you're going something that is over twice the amount, and you're not really getting half of the weight off of that, right? It's only kind of just a few ounces more. But what do you think, Jared?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that I gravitated toward those 6 Moon tents that I keep bringing up. But and eventually the Gossamer Gear, that when you're thinking about the cost and what you're actually saving, that my Deschutes Plus was 16 ounces, and I bought that for I think $140 after a coupon, or maybe 180, somewhere in there. And so the way that I'd encourage everybody to think about this would be, thinking about what you could buy with the money you saved. For instance, a plane ticket to somewhere awesome to go use that tent.
Yeah.
So if you could buy a plane ticket and rent a car for a few days, there's no reason that you need to try to cut 6 ounces out of your pack for $700 when you could have a nice, you get the idea. Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately the thing is, I agree with people who really want to lighten their weight by shrinking their tent and their pack size. But I would encourage everybody to know that there are a lot of options to get your tent down to under 2 pounds for under $300. So don't think you have to go out there and spend $700 on a DCF tent, especially if you're new to the hobby. Don't let people confuse you into thinking that somehow something more expensive is inherently better for you.
Right. Yeah, and I would second the whole point about like the packability as well. Like DCF does not pack down, folks. So if you're talking about internal volume, you're trying to go ultra light, or you're trying to shrink your pack, you got to keep that in mind, because you're not able to really compress that down that much. So just another thing to keep in mind there. The next bullet point, moving right along here, is really just a simple one, and it is to make sure that your tent, whatever it is waterproof. And that goes kind of beyond just the generic treatment on the outside fabric, right? You also want to make sure that it's either seam taped or seam sealed some other way. And that's just kind of like sort of like an additional pro tip. It's another bullet point that we have a little bit later on, but you want to make sure that you're looking out for that. I know Huck's all-time favorite, the Six Moon Designs, historically hasn't done that by default. I'm not sure if that's changing, but they do offer a service for an additional fee. Yeah, if it's not waterproof and you have to seam seal it yourself, it's going to take a little bit extra time, money, and just overall effort to get that done. But any thoughts on waterproofing just in general, guys? I know this is like an insanely interesting topic, but what do you think on waterproofing?
If a company offers to do the seam sealing, I'd say do it.
Totally.
I've done it a few times now. I've done it on a couple of my tents, and first time wasn't that easy, but second time around was a lot easier, but it takes a lot of time. So
yeah,
you got to set it out. You got to let it dry, and I just have a company do it.
Yeah, there's some good videos to show you how to do it if you have to do it. But to Huck's point there, you would spend $8 to $12 in materials just to do your own seam sealing, and then you would save. I think the Six Moon service is $30 per tent.
Yeah,
and so you're gonna basically save $18, and it's gonna be a real hassle. But it's frustrating to me, just as another hot take, right? That companies would, part of the reason that they sell them without the seam taping is so that they can sell a tent advertised at a lighter weight. And so, Six Moon, for example, they could do it. They do it for any tent that people pay for. So they could easily just sort of average out the cost and then seam tape every one. So the reason is really not about the capability or even the profitability of it, because they would still be the most affordable option on the market. But it's really so that they can advertise that weight. So be keeping an eye on that when we're thinking about weights, that a lot of times those lighter tents are not actually usable at the weight advertised. So the Gossamer gear, for example, that weight doesn't include stakes, right? And so you run into a lot of those Anyway, I'm rambling. I'll be quiet.
Well, I got to recap that. I know both Huck and Jared have been out on trips with these guys, and they've seen my handiwork in trying to seam seal my Lanchan 1. And I would definitely agree with Huck, like, get it done by somebody else, because if you have to try to like do it a couple times yourself, it's just going to look really bad. So let the pros kind of handle it there. The next one that I'm going to talk about here are just going to be the generic pros and cons of each, and we kind of touch base on it a little bit. For me, again, it's the packability of a particular type of fabric and then just in general for non-freestanding tents. They're just going to be lighter weight, especially if you use trekking poles when you're out on trail. It's going to take up less room in your pack because you don't have the addition of the poles and things like that. But again, speaking sort of like the Echo snack box from earlier, you don't have the luxury of, especially when you stake it out, just kind of like picking it up and moving it somewhere else. That's kind of a con con for me, and then the overall the floor size and everything too. But overall, I think it's mostly in the pro category. But what are you guys' thoughts on pros and cons? Anything else that kind of sticks out for you?
Yeah, I think there's one that's related to the packability, and it's where it can go in your pack. So some of my tarp tents and the Gossamer gear, I'm able to keep it outside of my tent, even in that sort of water sleeve when it's drying in the morning, because they do often collect that condensation. And then one of the cons, of course, is that that it's just going to require so much more of a sort of learning curve. But it kind of ties to the last pro that I'll mention, which is in harsher weather, you can often get them to tightened and taut much better than other tents. Like even freestanding tents, you're able to really tighten down and make it nice and taut.
Great point.
Yeah. And just going to like one of the cons you were saying earlier, is just like when you're getting stuff in there and you want to shake it out. Like just this past weekend, my buddy was using a Tiger Wall tent, and he was able to just shake out all the dust, no problem.
Yeah.
Well, I had to wait till I got home and then take my Lunar Solo and just turn it inside out, shake it out, and then put it back to the right side again.
And it's not unlike when you have to take down your tent. With a freestanding tent, you can take all of your gear out much easier without it getting wet. But whenever you let down some of the non-freestanding tents, they fall, and all of the water and condensation that's with them goes on everything pretty quickly. I mean, I guess you could empty it out, but it still gets all over. You get the idea.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think that you can still shake it out, but it's definitely a lot easier if you still have the pole structure in it, and like you take all your gear out. It's definitely easier. I would agree. The next item that I have here for you guys is going to be just pro tips. What kind of pro tips do you have? The only one that I kind of want to throw in here is, it really depends on the type of tent that you have, but particularly, and this is mostly in regards to the tents that have two poles. I would recommend situating the poles that kind of like go away from you a little bit more to kind of open up that interior space. If you have a tent that's kind of designed like that, again, the Gossamer gear, the one has it so that they really want to like recommend to you that the center poles, or the trekking poles that you have for the structure, kind of start out closer to your hips and then go further up, so you're increasing the overall livability when you go to sit up. Now, I know for Huck's Skyscape Trekker, it's a little bit of the reverse, if I'm not mistaken there, Huck, in that it's a little bit more narrow up top, but you're maximizing more of the bottom space when you're kind of like laying out at night. But what kind of pro tips do you guys have for non-freestanding tents?
I'll go first on this. One of the biggest things is setting it up at home. I've seen so many people I've watched some videos of guys when they first get their tent and they don't try setting it up, and they get out there and that thing is a mess. You go through, it's like Stevie Wonder put that tent together. But you could go set it up at home, practice a few times, and just like the Lunar Solo, a lot of people when they first get it think it's hard, but if you get the right height going on your trekking pole, it's going to make that bathtub floor fill in and just help with the breathability in there. And then one other one I have is just looking at the ground. A lot of people think that you have to have the perfect ground for a non-freestanding tent. You don't. I've had a few times where I've done a hike just in the local mountains, and I actually had to set up my Lunar Solo on a street path, abandoned road, and it was cement, and just use rocks. I've had to do that in rocky ground too, and use rocks instead of tent stakes, and you can pull it out and you can get your tent pretty taut that way.
I would just say with a lot of these freestanding tents, especially the ones we seem to be talking about, some of the smaller makers, don't be afraid to buy a tent and with the idea that you might sell it if you don't like it after a couple of uses, because the sort of return on selling in the used market, you can often sell pretty close to what you paid for it. So don't be intimidated by that. And then also know that with almost every one of these disadvantages, sort of the difficulty of setting it up, there are also real advantages. So it's definitely a trade-off. So it's harder to find a campsite or at least stake it in or set it up. But then once you do, it can be set up a lot more secure typically than some of the other tents. So you're getting this sort of almost direct trade-off with each of them. But give them a shot, because I think they've changed the way that I'm able to pack up my whole bag, because it packs smaller, which allows me to get a smaller backpack, which allows me to carry less on a lot of different levels.
Perfect. All right. I thought of one more that I want to throw in here too, and that is, again, kind of harkens back to the overall design of the tent. And not to give Huck a little bit too much praise here, but the Skyscape Tracker is just an amazingly designed tent, in that, again, if you can sort of focus on one that, especially if it's dual entry, even if it's a 1P, that just gives you a lot more options based on where you're actually pitching it, right? So I feel like, I don't know if you agree with this, Snack Box, but like the Gossamer Gear, the one, you kind of have just like one entry point. So if it's sloped and you're not in a particularly great spot, you can't just like easily like turn it around if you're in kind of like a tight jam. But if you have something that, you can get in on either side and likewise put your head on either end, then I think you're kind of just maximizing the overall options that you have.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's also, I mean, it's also cool to know how many different options there are out there, because you can really be thoughtful about each piece of it. If you, there's some without doors, there's some without bug net, there's some with bug net and no floors, there's some with floors but no bug net. There's just such a range of things, so different conditions can really be accommodated, and different skill levels as well.
One other tip before I forget is, when you set up these tents, they have sides that are designed to shed the wind. Like the Skyscape Tracker, that front end sheds the wind perfect. So when you're setting it up, you just want to make sure that that head end, or whatever side is made to shed the wind, is set up where the wind's going to come into it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And then I'm also going to echo again, Snackbox saying, like, make sure that it's tight, and especially the sides that are facing the wind. You want to make sure that it's tight, but not too tight, because I've had it like super tight at times too, and you still get that ripple effect kind of going in there. So yeah, it really takes a little bit more to kind of like dial that in, but can be very useful and awesome when you dial that in. The last thing that I have here is going to just be the final roundup here. I'll let you guys go first. Final verdicts. Are you all for trekking pole tents? Do they stink and they're just too finicky? What do you think? Pro or no? Pro go or no go?
Well, I came from, my first tent was like a Mountain Hardware Twin Arch 2 tent, and then went to REI tent, which were freestanding tents. And I always used to look at my friends' tents that were non-freestanding. It's like, I just don't know how that's going to do in the wind. And then they actually bought me my first tent for my birthday, which is pretty cool. And from then on, I've been a convert since like 2017. And all my tents now are non-freestanding tents.
Yeah, I've been using them for a long time and I really love them. But that said, I also, all in might be a little too strong, right? Like if I see somebody, sort of like Huck was talking about there, if I see somebody with a freestanding tent, I don't have any, I mean, I think they're making the right choice for them as well. So I think that typically what's nice about it is you can really figure out what works well for you. And if it is a non-freestanding tent, I think you're going to like it. I don't think a lot of people go back from that to a freestanding tent. But if you're more comfortable in a freestanding tent and you don't want to run the risk of sort of not being able to set it up when conditions are rough, I get that too.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a personal decision. I think, my final thought on that would be I'm definitely all for it. I think the first 1P tent that I got was non-freestanding. So I think, I don't know, just in general, I kind of view freestanding tents sort of more, I don't know. I think it's better suited for car camping. You can definitely get palaces that have these huge internal structures and really maximize the overall internal space and livability on the inside. But I think if you're going backpacking, give it a shot, and really try to, like Huck says, like, set it up in your backyard first, really kind of like figure out how best to stake it out and set it up, and you're kind of just good to go. And I think we can all agree that it's nowhere near as difficult as trying to set up a hammock or customizing a hammock and getting the correct lay and whatnot. So not nearly as hard about that one there. Any final thoughts on this one, guys? We are doing excellent on time. Just wanted to give you the floor one more time on anything that we might have missed.
Well, I think it's good to know with these tents that your friends, if you get up in the middle of the night, your friends will find it really funny and bond with you if you decide to pull a couple of stakes out of their tent and then run back to yours and go to sleep. It's a nice bonding experience, real team building, and I think everybody will have a laugh.
I've actually had that happen accidentally to me before.
Well, I can say that I've never been in a scenario where I've had to use my poop trowel as a stake because I busted too many stakes. So luckily I haven't hit that yet. Well, all right, guys. I think that's going to round this one up. Thanks again for joining me tonight. We've got, and I came prepared this time a little bit. Jared's channel here is called Outside Comfort Zone. I'm also going to post his social media stuff in the description down below. And then Jason's channel here, Huck, is Huck Outdoors here on YouTube. Make sure you check these guys' channels out and show them some love. Tell them that I sent you, and they'll give you a discount code for some sweet merch that they have in their shops currently. I don't think any one of us have merch right now, but I kind of wish I did.
I've been partnering with MeUndies and a couple of those Feels as well. What are the other common podcast sponsors?
Any poop hammocks? All right, guys. Thanks again for joining me tonight, and we'll see you guys on the next episode.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.